you know what? I'm going to skip dessert. And I'll skip dessert tomorrow night. And you do a little bit, and then all of a sudden, well, yeah, I'm going to exercise. If I'm going to wait until I feel like I want to exercise, let me tell you, it's never going to happen. But it's a lot easier to say, okay, let's just go out for a 10-minute walk. And I think there is something about this also with what we might think of as conversion or evangelism. Stark also writes that conversion to a new deviant, and deviant doesn't mean that it is that somewhat evil, it's just different from what is. To new deviant religious groups occurs when, other things being equal, people have or develop stronger attachments to members of the group than they have to non-members.
Isn't there a possibility that they found that the Roman gods weren't effective anymore?
Ooh, hang on to that. Hang on to that. You bet. You bet. But
is that one just saying people want to join the club?
It is a little bit of that. But when you see that other people are part of that club, and gosh, they seem to be happy, joyful, maybe joyful even more than happy.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about when Sally meets Harry, or whatever, you know, I want what she's having.
Yeah.
If you remember the flick. Wes may be too young for that.
I've seen reruns of black and white.
But absolutely. But, and this may be time for just a quick sidebar. I have long felt, when it comes to evangelism, that you see the sign on the side of the road and it says Jesus saves. Okay. Use a 401k. What's the far more important is relationships between those who are Christian with others. And in a sense, I think there are only 3 stories that really matter. And it starts ultimately with your story, the person with whom I'm. And once I know something about her story or his story, only then do I, in a sense, have the right to say something about my story. But when I tell my story, it inevitably will involve God's story, because my story and God's story are inextricably woven together now. And only then do I get, it doesn't start out with, by golly, you're a sinner and repent. Now, I'm not going to say that God can't work that way. It doesn't work for me. I don't think it works for most. I think it's ultimately relational. Just as our God is relational, this too is relational.
Question: if you, from a sociological point of view, if you just dropped religious out of that, wouldn't that be pretty much true of everything? Look at the Proud Boys and the far right. It's like they're not religious, but people identify with them more than people that are not in their group.
Oh, I think that's probably right. I think that's, again, I'm not a sociologist, but I think you're right, Tony. I really do. I think because ultimately people are relational. I mean, we're hardwired that way. That's just the way we are. But I invite you to at least to hang on to these kind of 2 thoughts as we go through these next bits. Well, so how did this grow? Well, the current scholarship is that early Christianity thrived probably among the more privileged, which is not to say it did not include less privileged. And I mean, indeed, one of the crucial things about this Christian movement is that it included everybody. But until the kind of the mid-20th century, the prevailing view is that Christianity had thrived primarily among what people understood to be the oppressed. And as recently as the 1930s, a very prominent Yale professor wrote that still more obvious an indication of the undesirability of Christianity in Roman eyes was the fact that its converts were drawn in overwhelming majority from the lowest classes of society. Then, as now, the governing classes were apprehensive of a movement which brought into a closely knit and secret organization the servants and slaves of society. Well, I think we have learned that maybe things were different. That view has changed. And another historian writing more recently writes that far from being a socially depressed group, the Christians were dominated by a socially pretentious section of the population of big cities. Beyond that, they seem to have drawn on a broad constituency, probably representing the household dependents of leading members. But the dependent members of city households were by no means the most debased section of society. If lacking freedom, they still enjoyed security and a moderate prosperity. The peasantry and persons in slavery on the land were the most underprivileged classes, and Christianity left them largely untouched. The thing is, Christianity, relative to how the Roman pantheon, the Greek gods, how people understood their relationship to something beyond themselves, was radically, radically different. And Stark maintains that new religions always involve new ideas. And if they consider citizens of the Roman world as they first confronted the Pauline Church, this was not simply a call to intensify their commitment to a familiar faith. And say, you got to do what you're doing, just do it better. It was not like that at all. Instead of calling Romans to return to the gods, Paul called them to embrace a new worldview, a new conception of reality, indeed to accept a new God. And we know that is true even from Paul's preaching in Athens in the book of Acts. And remember that Paul talked about, but you know, you've got this statue to the unknown God. Let me tell you about that God. That is the one who one of your own poets said is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. Christianity was totally different. It is no surprise, therefore, that the growth of Christianity really started as a mission to the Jews. And why is that significant, kind of thinking back to our maps early on for how this thing grew? Well, in the first century, the estimated population of what we think of today as Palestine was about 1 million people. And they were Jews. The estimated Jewish population in the diaspora, as it's called, I mean those who were beyond, was somewhere between 4 and 6. Far more Jews lived outside of Palestine than lived inside Palestine. And so going back to our comments earlier about that first Pentecost and all these people from, you know, Luke rattles off a whole slew of places all around the Mediterranean basin. Well, these were all Jews who had kind of done their duty in coming back to Jerusalem for the festival. The Jewish diaspora in the first century was heavily in this part of the world. By the 3rd century, it had grown. Just as the Christian movement had grown, so too had the Jewish.
So you're saying there was a bit of a parallel?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it because so many of the Jews were traders? Is that how they distributed their population so widely?
Well, or they could trade, and it was, I mean, and that's, you kind of, if I've gone to my, really kind of the next point, that all of this was eminently feasible because travel within the Roman world was extraordinarily easy, fluid. People traveled. I mean, Wayne Meeks, a emeritus professor now of church history at Yale Divinity School, that the people of the Roman Empire traveled more extensively and more easily than anyone before them did, or would again until the 19th century. That,
Built the first roadways.
well, they did.
And it was safe.
And they had the, what we called, today historians would call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, that if the whole Mediterranean basin, I mean, all around, was essentially controlled by the Romans, and I mean, people could trade easily back and forth, they could move around, and people walked. I don't know, I guess they felt their way into an action easily, or much better than I did. I don't,
More than 10 minutes a day.
they could do this stuff. And the other thing is that Christianity also likely found its foothold more firmly in urban contexts than in the countryside. And that, because it was in the urban contexts where there were other people. I mean, it wasn't, far easier to run into folks, and also far easier to find a place to start. Because Christianity would have resonated with Jews in the diaspora. Because you start with the kind of the opening gambit. This is the same God that our ancestors, going back to Abraham, have worshipped. This is just God doing this new thing among us in and through God's Son. And so the fact that they knew the story. They knew the story. Oops. Jews in the diaspora were also likely to be slightly more, well, I just think marginal in their belief and practice than Jews inside Palestine. I mean, and I think we see this in all kinds of ways. That if you work in a corporate headquarters, I mean, and if you're working halfway around the world, well, it's a little bit more flexible in some ways. It's, but it was just a little bit, kind of, they might be more open. They're also more worldly and more secular. Because these were women and men who lived in a society that was not their own. And so they were a little bit more flexible. And at the risk of, without getting into things that are maybe inappropriate, and if I do, forgive me, but even things like circumcision. For men who were Jews, who became then more active in commerce, and then you go to the Roman bath, well, guess what? You're different. And so we know that there were even efforts to undo circumcisions. Because people wanted somehow to fit in. Yes, they were Jewish, but they wanted to kind of to fit in. They were definitely more Hellenized, but yet not fully Greek. And more Hellenized, and part of that was they would use what we think of as the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. They were not likely to have been as readily kind of attuned to the Hebrew. It would have been more the Greek. And so when New Testament writings that we have, when they make references to the Old Testament, generally it is to language that would have been in the Septuagint, because that's the language that people would be most familiar with. And they lived, therefore, because of all this within their societies, they lived a little bit on the margins. And they were referred to as God-fearers. And 20 plus years ago, Connie and I were in Miletus, which is in the western part of Turkey. There is a Roman amphitheater. And on one of the stones, a couple of rows up from the bottom, is this inscription. And it is reserved seats for those who are called God-fearers.
Oh, wow.
This is for Jews. I mean, it's just really kind of interesting.
Were they good seats?
Well, if you like to be close to the action, that was really good.
Right there,
But
50-yard line, right?
if some of us like to be in the back row in the cinema, well,
But it seems like if the Jews had been in control, that they would react poorly to all these new people breaking away.
well, and in fact, that's another class. No, but you're right, and in fact, the fight between what we think of, I mean, in the middle of the first century, there were a lot of, there were many Jewish sects, each kind of vying for, and we could name, I bet we could each here name two right off the top of our heads. One would be the Pharisees, another would be the Sadducees. And the Pharisees were critical of the Sadducees because the Sadducees, didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead, right? And after the temple was destroyed in the year 70, the temple had been kind of the glue that held all this stuff together. It became increasingly difficult for Jewish Christians, and that's how Christianity is not a separate religion. It is we are, in a sense, we have been grafted on to the promises that were made by God to the people of Israel, yea, these many years ago. But things began to separate, and we know there was conflict. In the Gospel of Matthew, there's referred to, be careful of people and their synagogues. It's not our synagogues, it's their synagogues.
Right.
Right? Matthew would be a great case study to look at, to see how that begins to kind of shape, and how the Matthean community began to separate from. But we know that many of the early converts were diasporan Jews, because the names in the letters that are in the New Testament are names of people that would be known to have had Jewish roots. Archaeological evidence also points to Christian communities kind of being in close contact or even part of synagogues. Again, I said earlier that much of the New Testament assumes a familiarity with the Septuagint more so than with the Hebrew translation the Hebrew Bible, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And we know that, where did Paul go? And we know this from the book of Acts. He shows up in town, and where does he go to meet people?
Synagogue.
He goes to the synagogue. And we know, too, that even as Christianity became, in a sense, more separated from Judaism, it never really lost its Jewish roots. And one sign of this, in the 2nd century, there was a very kind of a firebrand kind of guy by the name of Marcion. And Marcion's contention was, what do we need the Old Testament for? All we need is the story of Jesus. We need the New Testament. So let's blow out the Old Testament. And the answer to that was, no way. And if there had not still been in a sense, a Jewish connection Marcion probably would have had a far more positive reception. And we also know that Old Testament texts were increasingly reinterpreted or reimagined, understood as having pointed to Jesus. And sometimes they even change things a little bit because, well, to fit the narrative. And if you want, one of the, for me, prime examples of this would be, we can look at the second chapter of Matthew, and that's something that we will be reading in a couple months' time, and that in Matthew chapter 2, verse 6, "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among